Hello everyone, my name is Daniel de Liever. I'm from New Rechts, or for our English speakers, New Right. And I'm happy today to introduce Rolf Schuhammer. I hope I pronounced it correctly, but thank you for being here.
Well, thanks so much for having me. It's a great pleasure and a great honor. I hope that I can live up to the expectations of your viewers and listeners.
I'm sure it's going to be a good conversation. And for those that don't know you, you're like an assistant professor in international relations at Webster Vienna Private University, and you specialize in how culture, values, and ideologies influence state behavior. And if that's not enough, you're also a journalist and podcaster. Before we go into, there's so much to talk about, of course, in European politics. I'm quite curious, why did you actually start this career in academia?
Well, to be quite honest, I hadn't. This will be part of my answer to your question. I had a recent career change. You couldn't know that because this is very, very fresh. So this just happened after we agreed on our schedule for this podcast. I'm now running the Center for Applied History at the MCC in Budapest, the Matthias Corvinus Collegium. So I kind of switched a little bit out of the university life and into the think tank world. To answer your question, how this happened, to be quite honest, it's very hard to say. It was a lot of it, I would argue, was sheer coincidence. Like you, I was always interested in politics. I was always interested in history. And the simple dream was to have a job where I get paid to deal with things I'm interested in anyways, because I felt this would be the best way to make money without it feeling like a job, right? You pursue your passions and you get paid for it. I mean, my dream job would have been to become a football player, because that's something I like to do even more, but unfortunately I'm not good enough. So nobody would ever pay money to see me play football, but luckily enough, people do pay me a little bit of money to hear me comment on things or to write articles or to teach classes or anything in that area. But it's something I do with a great passion, and kind of my advice to all of your listeners when they plan their career is find something that you're both passionate about and that you can make a living off. I think that's the best combination there is.
I agree. That's, I guess, why I'm here is, you can't win them all. Everybody has a dream, like, for example, becoming a soccer player that is less realistic. Why did you decide to change it up, to go out of the universities, basically?
Because I felt that the biggest problem in the area of academia very often is that if you have something to say in an academic fashion, it takes very long to get it published, right? You submit something to a journal, it goes through the review process, you get it back, you resubmit it. Like, it can take up to a year. A colleague of mine, it took 18 months to get a paper published. But with everything that's currently going on in the world, right? We live in a very fast-paced world, particularly when it comes to politics. I want to get my opinion, my commentary out as quickly as possible. So I felt it was a little bit unfair to cloak myself with the reputation of an academic when I actually have switched more to be a commentator. I think it's also a little bit about honesty to my audience, because I'm no longer spending much time, let's say, in an office writing, long form papers that hopefully then get published a year from now. I do more commentary now. I do more podcasts. I do more op-eds. So I kind of shifted much more into the, let's call it, rapid fire opinionating than the long-term analysis.
That's a fair point. And I think we see in the space of politics and commentators, we see that especially if you have a more right-wing opinion, and I guess both of us share that, of course, that's why we're also talking about that there can be a lot of criticism from the left and demonization. How has this been for you, and how have you dealt with this?
Well, my personal experience has been a very good one. I mean, I tend to be also on social media. I try not to be too provocative, or let me put it differently. I try not to directly attack people, and I have a very simple philosophy, especially on X or Twitter or whatever it is. If somebody makes a nice comment or asks a serious question, I reply. If somebody is just there to, throw around vulgarities or insults, I mute them, and that is done. And I have to admit, so far, I've never ever blocked. I never want to give anybody the pleasure, so to speak, of being blocked. But I find the mute button on social media very, very helpful. And then these people can scream into the ether, but I neither have to hear nor read it. And so far, this has served me very well. It's a little bit the philosophy that that's an old saying, but it sounds better in German. It goes along these lines: the way in which you shout into the forest shouts back at you. So I think if you don't necessarily pick fights, the number of people that pick fights with you also tends to be fairly small, and that has worked very well for me. Here in Budapest, of course, I find a wonderfully, let's call it, conservative, biased environment, which makes things much easier for me. But overall, my experience has been that there is a general shift, especially among the younger generation. This has helped me in my days at the university very much. The university leadership, even though they were not entirely happy with my political leanings, they could not do that much because it has become very early on quite clear that the students share a lot of those views, right? That the students themselves, the Gen Z has a tendency towards the right. Not so much at the university. I think that's more true outside the university spectrum, but it's also happening more in the university. So my personal experience has been a very good one, but I think I was lucky. I have to immediately say this. I was lucky that the people I've been working with were never hardcore ideologues. Like there was one person once at university who was constantly writing letters to the leadership about how horrible my views are and that I should have no place at that university. But credit where credit is due. The university leadership kind of always had my back, and I left on good terms with them. So the career choice or the career change I made was not because I felt uncomfortable. It was just time for something new.
It's a very interesting point that you say that people are turning more right. Like, I would say maybe it's in the Netherlands, but also in, I think, other countries like America, maybe on universities, it's a little bit skewed towards the left. At least the people that are very loud. But you're saying that people are turning more to the right. Why do you think that young people are turning things around?
Well, I think but I think there are two reasons. One reason is that the generation under 30 in their mid-20s, like most young people do, they look for new forms, or they look for forms of meaning. They look for forms of identity. And for several reasons, I would argue that patriotism, nationalism, national identity, national traditions, that is something that is becoming more popular again. I can tell you a quick anecdote. I know anecdote is not data, but I think it's interesting. I come from a small town in Austria, and for a very, very long time, regional associations, small clubs, the voluntary firefighters, and all these small get-togethers that do traditional things, whether it's stitching dresses for certain dances, kind of very old-fashioned things, if you want, lederhosen, so to speak. And they always had a huge problem because they had no young people. Like they said, okay, we're gonna die out. Kind of the old guard who still does it, but the young people are not interested in this, and basically we're gonna close up shop very early on. But over the last 2 years, they say they're overwhelmed by the number of young people who want to rejoin these associations, these clubs, these traditional these clubs that basically only exist to prolong certain traditions. And I think that is a sign that these things are coming back in vogue. It's no longer like there was a time when you were running around in traditional Austrian garb, the metaphorical or the literal action, the lederhosen, right? People would kind of raise their brow and kind of look at you and roll their eyes. But this has changed. Like you can see it also, just another example. You can see that weddings, right? There was a long time when weddings were kind of the American style wedding, like tuxedo and the bride in white and all these kind of things. But more and more what you in Austria see is that more and more people actually want to have traditional weddings in traditional Austrian dress. Now, again, this is anecdotal, but it's interesting because if you would have asked somebody that question 5 years ago, they would have said all of this is going to die out, right? The Dirndl, the lederhosen, the regional clubs, the traditional associations, all these things, it's going to die out because the young people, they orient towards, the United States. They, the kind of what influences them is more modern or postmodern ideas, and everything that is connected to tradition is interpreted as stale, as boring, as reactionary, and they will forever turn their backs on it. But now it turns out that the exact opposite is happening. So I think that is a reason. And we also, of course, see it in election results. I mean, these are probably the clearest indicators. The Austrian Freedom Party, who for the first time since 1945, right? We had federal elections in Austria just a couple of weeks ago. For the first time since 1945, it was neither the Social Democrats nor the Conservatives. It was the Freedom Party. And the reason why they did is because of voters under 35. In Germany, the AfD, but if it wouldn't be for voters over 60, the AfD would be significantly stronger than they already are. And there are anecdotes, But there's also pretty hard empirical data that shows that Gen Z is shifting to the right. There's no doubt about it.
I think it's an interesting point. Of course, you're Austrian. It's also maybe interesting to ask you about the Austrian politics. Like you said, the FPÖ, the Freedom Party, which in a sense, people compare to the Freedom Party we have in the Netherlands with Geert Wilders. Like you said, it became the biggest. But there's this criticism around FPÖ that they are like this extreme right party with kind of the dark past. Do you think this is like fair criticism of?
Well, let me put it this way: that there is a dark past, if you want to use that expression. That is not entirely wrong. But on the other hand, in Germany, you have with Die Linke, the left, right, the name of one party, or now the Alliance Sarah Wagenknecht, you have political parties that can be directly traced back to the socialists of Eastern Germany, right, which was a dictatorial, authoritarian a party that is responsible for significant crimes against humanity and human rights violations. And is it true that the founding members of the FPÖ, that some of them at least, were former Nazis? Yeah, that is absolutely correct. I think there's no need to deny this. By the way, the Freedom Party itself has never denied their past. But the problem with this argument is you cannot explain the attractiveness that they have or the appeal that they're having now for under 30-year-olds. Like if you tell a 25-year-old that you're voting for a party that in 1960 had a significant number of former Nazis in it, this is so far away from them, right? This has absolutely no meaning. This is why the idea of blackmailing people into not voting for them with constantly re-invoking that quote-unquote dark past is no longer working. So is it true? Yeah, but every political party has a history. I mean, I think this is something we should not forget. And if you take the Austrian and German case, if we would start discussing about former Nazis who made a career in post-war Austria and post-war Germany within the traditional parties, either the Social Democrats or the Conservative Party, that list would be very long, which is, by the way, somewhat understandable, because what was the expectation? The war ended in 1945. The country still needed to run. So you had the civil servants, you had the expertise, you had all these people, and many of them were former Nazis, but you still needed them to run the country. So this idea of purification was never entirely possible. Some of them went to the traditional parties, and some of them then also joined new parties like the FPÖ. So historically, what you say is correct, but do I think that it is vastly overstated? Yes. And more importantly, does, at the time of speaking right now, at this moment in time, is it a Nazi party? And the answer is, without any doubt, no, not at all, right? The FPÖ is many things. You could have made the argument they were in the early 90s. They were kind of playing around with this a little bit. The then party leader, Jörg Haider, he tended to meet with World War II veterans. He tended also to meet with members of the SS. So there was something, like there was always kind of teasing, let's say, a little bit with this ideology. But I would argue that since the early 2000s, this is no longer the case.
That's a fair point. And even though they became the biggest, we see now this kind of cordon sanitaire. They are unable to form a government, as even like the Conservatives VP is like not willing to govern with them. Well, what do you think about the fact that the biggest Austrian party now is unable to form a coalition?
Well, I think it's a problem because it has been, let's call it an unspoken or an informal convention for all of Austrian political history since 1945, that the party that comes in first in elections is the party that is then tasked by the president to form a government. Now the Austrian president, who was a former member of the Green Party, has decided to kind of break with this president, kind of to break with that convention, and give the second strongest party, the Conservative Party, the task of forming a government. Like, he is legally in the right. He was not breaking any law, but he was breaking a 79-year-old tradition. And I think it's important to keep in mind that democracies, and whatever form, liberal democracies or otherwise, but generally political systems, they don't just function based on the formal institutions, they also are based on the informal institutions, like conventions, like the acceptance that things are done a certain way, even though that certain way is not written down and legally binding. So I think this is a significant risk the Austrian political establishment is taking now. Because once you start breaking convention, you cannot then expect the other side to stick to it. So, and there will be a day when the Freedom Party, most likely, I would say in 2 to 3 years, when they are not going to come in first with 29% of the vote, they might come in first with 34% of the vote. There will be new presidential elections in a couple of years, and then maybe it's not going to be the left of center candidate who wins the presidential election. It's going to be maybe the right of center candidate who wins the presidential election. And then if hypothetically a left-wing party comes in first, then this new president is going to say, well, remember back in 2024 when the right came in first and they didn't get the task to form a government? Now I'm going to do the same to the left-wing party that came in first. So this is very dangerous. So, once the toothpaste is out of the tube, you can't get it back in. And if you break a convention once, you don't expect the other side then to stick to it. I think this was a vast mistake, a huge mistake on part of the Austrian president, on part of the Austrian political establishment, because now it's broken, right? Now you own it, as they say at Bad Bath and Beyond. You break it, you own it. And this is exactly the case that's happening now.
That's a fair point. I guess a lot of people, I think in general in Europe, but also in Austria, they are voting for parties like the FPÖ because they are seeing a lot of challenges. They're kind of worried. What do you think are like the major challenges in Austrian society and politics at the moment?
Well, I think Austria is a little bit of a mirror in what's going on all over Europe, but I would even argue what is going on all over the West. So I think they're not, they're more a bellwether than an exception here. I mean, just to remind your listeners, the first successful right-wing populist party was the FPÖ in the early 90s. I mean, I always remember in 1993, they made a public referendum that was called Austria First, Österreich zuerst. So we kind of had this idea of country first before Donald Trump came up with America first. So I think that Austria is always a good bellwether here, and especially the Austrians usually are not as shy as, for example, the Germans or the French or others when it comes to voting for right-wing parties. And to answer your question about what's the reason for this, well, I would argue it's the failed policies of the last 30 years. There is a general sense, and again, I think that's not limited to the Austrians. I think that's true in the Netherlands. I think that's true in France. I think that's true in Germany. There is a sense that, well, actually, there are two senses. One is that things are not moving in a direction that is beneficial for the future of the country. And I think the second sense is, and that's probably even the more problematic and stronger one, is that current governments all over the West are not acting in the interest of their people. By the way, I think that both of these sentiments are correct. You see this in the migration question. I think you saw it in the COVID question. I think you see it in economic policies. I think there is a sense that in many cases, the governments that are still staffed by an elite that was educated in the left-wing universities and left-wing institutions of the 70s, 60s, and 80s, and maybe early 90s, right? That they are not patriots. They are not nationalists. They don't really put their country first. And most people want their government to put their country first. I mean, to be quite honest, up until very recently, this was the most natural thing in the world, right? An Austrian government would put the Austrian people first. The Dutch government would put the Dutch people first. But nowadays, there is a sense that the governments in the West, they have, climate change, immigrants, asylum seekers, like everybody seems, or it appears at least, as if everybody is more important than their own people. And this is why people increasingly turn to parties where at least they have the hope that they will put their interests first again.
That's fair. I think we see that indeed all over Europe. I think there are a lot of similarities to what you're saying to what we see in the Netherlands. And I guess one of the big problems in this is like the media itself, journalism. That's now something you're actively in as a commentator, and that makes you also more in the public area. So I'm also quite curious, like, what do you want people to remember you for as a person and as a public person?
I'm not sure if anybody I hope that my parents and my significant other will remember me. I think that's the greatest hope I have. I don't think that I will leave such an impact on the world, but it's very kind of you to say that. No, I think the important thing is, as you say, I'm a commentator, right? When I publish something, it's opinion. I don't make a secret out of the fact that it is my opinion. What bothers me in the contemporary media environment is that very often left-leaning positions are presented as the objective state of affairs. Like, if we have a debate with somebody who's to the left and they present a left-leaning opinion, that makes complete sense, but it's still an opinion. But this idea to say that everything that's left of center is fact, this is something that worries me. For example, when you look at the way in which currently reporting is done about Donald Trump. And you have the sense that, at least in European media, right, the idea that Trump is a fascist is like an objective fact. No, it isn't. That you can have that opinion, but it's still an opinion. It is not an objective fact. Or if you look at something like the debate about, gender issues, sure, you can have the opinion that there are 77 different genders. That's an opinion you can have, but it's not a fact. And the idea that it is, if you say, just to stick with this example for a second, if you say there are 77 genders, that's that's the objective, moderate position. But if you say, I think actually there are only 2 genders, then that's the radical, reactionary, right-wing fascist position, right? This is the kind of framing that I also think bothers many people, because many things that they consider to be absolutely beyond dispute are now being torn apart and turned upside down. I mean, this is the interesting part about the so-called culture wars, again, in Europe as well as in the United States. The right has never been on the offensive, right? The right was pretty much content with where it was the left that always went into the offensive, right? First, it was gay marriage, then it was the transgender issue, and now we have reached the point of biological males competing in the Olympic Games in female boxing. And again, the idea, if you're against that, you're the radical, and if you're for it, you're the moderate. And it's this gaslighting, it's this kind of turning reality upside down that I think increasingly bothers many people. And the reason for this is, I know it's a very long answer, I apologize, but the reason for this is that as the political class, the political leadership has been marinated in a very specific institutional setup, so have been the journalists. The dividing line between left-wing politicians and left-wing journalists, and about 90% of them are left-wing, I mean, that dividing line can barely be seen anymore. I mean, the New York Times, right, Der Spiegel in Germany, Der Stern in Germany, MSNBC is maybe not so much, but CNN, for example. I mean, they don't hold anybody, they don't speak truth to power. They don't hold anybody accountable. They are basically press secretaries for whoever is the left of center candidate. People took a while to catch on to it, but I think they have now come. And that's one of the other reasons why I believe that right-wing parties are so successful, because they're also seen as voting for them is also seen as a revolutionary act against a media political cartel that no longer does its job.
I think you had hit a lot of good points there. I do agree that there are a lot of people that see it. I think the biggest problem, though, that people nowadays have, when they realize that maybe the media is not as objective as they make it out to be, is then you get to a point, okay, I've trusted my whole life in the BBC or the CNN or whatever it might be. Like we have the NOS and stuff like that in the Netherlands. Then people come to the point, where can I find reliable news sources? We now all the time hear about things like fake news. And people get kind of confused where they can find reliable news and information. What would you tell people, just ordinary people who are not journalists themselves, who want to find reliable news sources?
I think most people know. I mean, I do the same. Sometimes I get sucked into let's say, the more raucous and the more outrageous reporting, because it's also entertaining. But I think most people know which sources they can trust. There are plenty of, I think your medium, I write for the medium Brussels Signal. I think there are plenty of right of center media outlets there that still represent the kind of position that you just described. I think the opinion page, just not the news page, but the opinion page of the Wall Street Journal. I think that the Telegraph, at least on occasion, has a center-right position. So I think there are media out. And of course, if you use Twitter or X in a responsible way, it can be a great source of information. I have to admit, I get lots of my news from there, and you just have to be careful not to get sucked into the kind of fake news. Fake news is such I call it always exaggerated news. Right? The problem nowadays we have very often is that, for example, somebody whom I admired for a long time, right? Somebody like Tucker Carlson, for example, right? Many of the symptoms, many of the problems that they diagnose, I think they are correct. I think they just then go a step too far. Like I'm sure that many of your viewers and listeners have heard this when he recently did this interview with a self-declared historian who was explaining that actually Hitler was not the bad guy in World War II, that actually Churchill was the bad guy in World War II. That's, I think, going a little bit too far. I'm the German speaker here, right? So if the Austrians and Germans would get exonerated for World War II, as intriguing and seductive as that might sound, I don't think it would be historically correct. But just to give you a quick answer to your question in a shorter form, but of course you're right. That is the problem that you have nowadays. If you feel that one side of the aisle or specific institutions have always lied to you, then at some point you start saying even the things that they say that are true, right? For example, if CNN says 3 times 3 is 9, they are not wrong, right? Not everything they say is necessarily wrong. But I think there is such an anger and resistance that has been built up right of center that they have reached this point where even if somebody on the left is saying 3 times 3 is 9, that they say, no, we don't believe you. And if then Tucker Carlson says 3 times 3 is 10, they're willingly inclined to believe Tucker more than they would believe, CNN, even though they know that probably Tucker is not right. I think there's a lot of, and which is completely understandable, by the way, right? So I don't mean this in a negative sense, but there's a lot of emotion behind this as well. Because as I said before, people understand that whether it's the matter of migration, whether it was COVID policies, whether it was inflation, right? Like all things that affected pretty much every person in their daily life, that the information that came from the government, from the media, in many ways was not truthful. Now, we can discuss whether they were deliberately lying, whether they were just incompetent, whether it was a mixture of both, which I think is probably the most likely scenario. But they built up such a high level of distrust that now you have this backlash where people say, you lied to us in such important areas of our lives that from now on, we don't believe anything anymore. And the big problem, I think this is a very important issue now, the big problem now, instead of governments saying, you know what, that's true, we made significant mistakes, no, we need a clean slate, we apologize, we try to do better. What you see now happening in Germany, what you see happening in the UK, I don't know if it's also happening in the Netherlands, it's not yet happening in Austria, is that in fact governments are clamping down on those people who I think justifiably voice their criticism. Right? For example, in the UK, if you make Facebook posts the government doesn't like, they can arrest you, they can imprison you. In Germany, right, if you're like, if 3 people meet in some place to read from a right-wing book, all of a sudden the police storms it. In Germany, they discussed that they want to ban the AfD. Right, so instead of taking that criticism seriously and say, you know what, maybe you guys are right, maybe we made a mistake, they are now trying to silence that criticism. Now, what recently came out of the UK and the US, right, they say, oh, we need to, and I'm directly quoting, we need to kill Elon Musk's Twitter, right? Because oh my God, because this is a platform where people can voice criticism, where people can vent their dissatisfaction. And this is what worries me the most. Instead of governments, with few exceptions, I think in Sweden they did it differently, in Denmark they did it differently, but in the UK, in the US, in Germany, I think in the Netherlands, instead of doing some introspection and say, okay, what did we do wrong? They are actually going after the critics. And I think this is going to be one of the biggest problems in the years to come.
It's a very good point. Yes, I today actually also wrote something about this whole thing about Elon Musk. I think it's crazy that at some point, that the Social Democrats, they're also, they cared a lot about honor as well. And now that you have some left-wing NGO, that now the head of it, the founder of it is advisor to Kamala Harris campaign, who are trying to basically influence the election by sabotaging X and Elon Musk. I think that kind of shows that people are having a hard time, because even if you say are aware of the fact that there are problems in the media and with how governments act, and that this goes against the core principles that gave rise to success in the West, and people still want to feel like going back to normal, not like the new normal as they said during COVID, but like the old normal of common sense. For that, I think journalism needs to be restored as well, also on the left side, as a trustworthy institution. So I'm curious, what do you think? How can we, as people, how can we restore journalism as something serious?
You made such an excellent point. Let me just add on to it. Similarly, what we just had in Germany, a similar case where they defined what they call trusted flaggers. And the trusted flagger is an institution that can flag content on the internet as being fake news, for example, right? And as it turned out, all these quote-unquote trusted flaggers are all left of center So you can imagine, right? We had the same case in the United States where all the fact checkers are left of center. So what they do all the time basis, they look at opinion pieces, anything that comes from the right, and they just kind of almost by default then flag it as misinformation, as disinformation, or as fake news. I mean, just as a reminder, we have U.S. elections coming up. Remember 4 years ago, the Hunter Biden laptop story. When this was a true story, right? I mean, the entire Hunter Biden laptop story was true. And the entire media and almost all the fact checkers simply declared it being wrong. It was like Russian misinformation. It has all the characteristics of a Russian operation. Of course it was true. Like everybody knows it now. The same thing was true just if you go back a couple of months now, that every time a right-wing outlet said that it looks like as if Joe Biden might not be at his mental height anymore, right? There seem to be some indicators that he might be in an early stage of dementia. Fake news, not enough. The fact checkers went out and said Joe Biden is in the best shape, best form he has ever been, and all the things that they're all made up. They called it, I think, not deep fakes, cheap fakes. I think it was CNN who used it. When basically right-wing media just showed videos of Joe Biden stumbling around because he didn't know where he was, like they couldn't say it was a deep fake because it wasn't, so they called it a cheap fake. Like all these kind of things, and there was no flagging from the fact checkers because the fact checkers all agreed with this representation because they were in the tank for the left and for Biden themselves. Now, going back to your question, I think one of the first steps would be, if I would be a newspaper, I don't know what your education, your training is, but in my experience, some of the best journalists never went to journalism school. I think the idea that in order to be a journalist, you have to get a journalism BA, and then get an MA in media, and then maybe, a post-graduate degree in newspaper writing. That's ridiculous. Journalism is something, that's why I always say I'm a commentator, I'm not a journalist. But journalism is something, if you have a talent to do it, but if you are a good writer, if you have a keen nose for stories, for interesting things, if you get along with people and you can get them to speak openly to you, either on or off the record, that's the qualities you want to see in a journalist, and not if they went to Columbia Journalism School. Because this brings it back to what I said originally. We have this elite class, both in the world of economics, in the world of politics, and in the world of media, and they all have been educated and marinated in the same worldview, in the same ideology, and that's very tedious. I think a good newspaper should hire people that know how to write. There are many people out there, by the way. Just a quick other point, whether it's Ta-Nehisi Coates or whether it's Ibrahim X. Kendi. These people are not great writers. I'm also not a great writer, but I never claimed that I'm one. But the only reason why they are hailed as these fantastic authors is because they come from the same ideological corner where most of their critics come from. And this is, I think, another one of these elements where I say, you know what, this is no longer open criticism. I know I make this, I can open a whole can of worms, but I think it is important. Look at what's happening at Disney, right? Because I think that's part of the same broader story where you have, or at Amazon, right? You have fantastic source material like The Lord of the Rings or the whole Star Wars universe. But since everybody who's working with that material was marinated, was socialized in left-wing ideology, right? Then what you get, left-wing, not left of center, radical leftist interpretations of whether it's the Star Wars universe or whether it's the Lord of the Rings, and I think it ruins everything. Don't get me wrong. I think if it would be the mirror image and everything, or the dominance of the left would be entirely replaced with the dominance of the right, it probably would be just as bad. But we have to deal with the world as it is, and currently you have this massive left-wing dominance and not a right-wing dominance. So again, also for a journalist, this is the thing that bothers me the most. If I'm a journalist, and I open the newspaper and I say, okay, 90%, again, I use the European American example, 90% of my colleagues endorse left-wing parties. 90% of my colleagues across the Atlantic endorse, Kamala Harris or Joe Biden. As a journalist, I mean, isn't that a story in itself? Wouldn't I be curious to say, why is it that the journalists look at the world so differently than a significant part of the voters? What do they see differently? Why do they view the world so in such different ways than we do? That'd be an interesting story, but they're not because they don't see themselves as journalists. They see themselves as activists. They don't want to report the news to the people. They don't want to tell people interesting stories. They want to tell people what they have to be interested, right? Which is why they run, 10 million stories on climate change, even though most people no longer particularly care about climate change. Or they run 1 million stories on, I don't know why. What did I recently read? Why McDonald's is racist, or since Elon Musk got into politics, why sending rockets to the moon is sexist, or to Mars, right? Because they don't want to inform you, they want to indoctrinate you, just in the same way that they have been indoctrinated them. But they don't even have the self-awareness, it seems, to understand or accept that they have been indoctrinated themselves. And that's kind of the somewhat funny but also sad part. So again, if I would be running a newspaper, I would almost make it one of my main conditions not to hire someone who got 10 degrees in journalism and just hire somebody who thinks he's a great writer. Let me just one last point. Who I think is the best writer in the English-speaking language at the moment is the Canadian author Mark Steyn, right? Mark Steyn never went to journalism school. Mark Steyn never went to Columbia School of Journalism or what have you. But he's a fantastic writer. He's an excellent journalist. And this is why people read him. Actually, he was the first one to make this point, is that this idea that you need to go 8 years to university and college to become a journalist is completely ludicrous. You have to sit down, you have to write, you have to write, you have to write, you have to write. And hopefully one day you'll get good enough that people want to read what you're writing. That was a long answer. I'm very sorry.
It's a funny point. No, it's a good point. Like I myself, for example, I didn't even plan to become a journalist, if you can call it that. I was trained in clinical psychology to be a therapist. I started writing for conservative newspapers like the Hungarian Conservative or the European Conservative about mental health, and why, let's say, the left-wing Western outlook is kind of making people more mentally ill. And then all of a sudden I went into it when I started working at Nieuw Rechts. But I agree with you. You need a great mind for it. You need to actually want to engage with it. You need to be actually curious. I think that's the thing that people miss a lot, curiosity about what's going on in the world. Like you said, people are not curious that 90% of journalists are left-wing and why they do. And this is what made the West so great, right? Curious, self-criticism.
Yeah.
This is kind of gone. So I hope we can restore it. And then I'm also curious, like we also, of course, as like journalists ourselves, we have also our own responsibility. So how do you deal with these challenges as a journalist yourself so that you don't fall into similar traps?
For me, I believe I know that I have an ideological bias. Right? As I said before, I never claim to be objective because I'm not. I believe I'm an ideologue. I mean, again, I'm open to some extent, but as I said, I'm a patriot. Even go a step further, I consider myself what I call a cultural nationalist. So what I mean by that is I believe that national identities and national values can be joined by people who were not born in a country. So I think it is no problem for a foreigner to become an Austrian if they fully commit to Austrian values, to Austrian habits, and so on and so on. I think it will then get easier from generation to generation. But just in a sense, I lived in the United States. I have great admiration and love for the United States, and I never had a problem to integrate in their values. So I believe that nationalism is not necessarily connected to any kind of biological or racial component. But I'm a strong believer that there are these historically grown. I think that within states, there is a hierarchy. And by hierarchy, I mean that not everybody is the same. I think that the people who have been living in the country for generations need to be treated with priority compared to those who just recently came across. I think that community is a reality that, especially in Europe and the West, especially since the Enlightenment, we have neglected. Like the idea of a society consisting solely of atomized individuals was an interesting vision, but I think it's simply not the case. We are a social species. We are social beings. I think that the government, the state, has a role to play in the creation of communities. I'm a huge advocate for mandatory military service, not for the warfighting capacity. I think that's almost a side effect. But I think it's important to get young men together and to kind of channel their energies into constructive ways, to help them work together on something. Battery, I think these are all very, very important elements. So yeah, I've said I have an ideology. I don't think that all values are the same. I think that Christianity or Judeo-Christianity as a component of Western nationalism, if you will, is an important element. People who live in Islamic countries, I wish them the best of luck. I have no problem with Islam in the Islamic world. I do have a problem with Islam in the Western world, because there are belief systems and values that are not compatible. And then you have to make a choice. And the big lie that the West is telling itself is that you can have all kind of different ideas coexist in the same state, in the same community, in the same country, or the same society. But that belief ultimately destroys those societies, because they are no longer one society. They become parallel existing societies. And this is what you see in all the urban centers all over the West. And I think this is wrong. I think this needs to be as much as possible reversed, including, of course, finding ways to lower the number of people with a migrant backgrounds in those countries. Again, not by violent means. No, I'm not talking about deportations. But just, for example, by a moratorium on immigration from non-Western countries. By thinking what is Poland currently. I mean, again, Poland and the current Polish government is more to the left than the previous one. You know what? We understand that the right to asylum is very important, but the right for national cultural survival is more important. So we might put a pause on handing out visas for asylum seekers, for refugees for a while. You know, either month, years, we'll see. Therefore, I believe the primary responsibility of a government is to ensure the continuation of the civilization, the culture of the people, nothing more. So yes, this to answer your question. I know that these are opinions, right? These are not objective facts, because some people might say, nope, we think that the nation is a horrible thing, it shall be abandoned. We think that the future is a diverse, multicultural society, and it's no problem to have the gay couple live right next to the fire-breathing imam with his 4 child bride. Again, I don't think that it is possible. Some people might think it is, but this is then a clash of ideas and different views. I would never, ever claim that my views are objective. They're not, right? And I think this helps me, because if someone says, so Ralph, you know, are you an objective journalist? My answer will always be no, absolutely not.
That's a good point. The only thing I would add, though, is yes, you can say that neither of us, I guess, in this sense, is objective, because we have opinions, but those opinions can still be based on something. And some opinions, in that sense, like if my opinion is that 3 times 3 is 10, I can think that. It does not make it right. And there are some opinions that are more corresponding with reality than others. But in general, I agree with you. I think when you turn it to European politics, that a lot of people, let's say, no matter if it's in Austria, if it's in the Netherlands, if it's France, Germany, they're kind of sick of at this point that they want to see things change in their lives. They cannot pay their rent anymore. They see that their surroundings are changing. They see Islamization happening. They see also many things, and a lot of governments are very reluctant to actually do something about them. A lot of people become demoralized. What do you think that ordinary people of Europe, what can they actually do to be hopeful, to contribute to make Europe great again, as Trump would say in the European sense?
Well, I think the key answer to your question is, and this is one of the things that worries me the most, we cannot get anything done anymore. I mean, there was a very interesting report regarding the UK, but I think it's also true in other parts of Europe and the United States. Is that, just to give you one example, the Golden Gate Bridge, right, was built in 4 years, I think between 1933 and 1937. Does anybody really think that this would still be possible today? Let's not kid ourselves. We couldn't do it any longer, right? Because, you know, you would have to make an environmental impact study of the environmental impact study of the environmental impact study. And then you need, 10,000 permits, and you'd never reach the point where you actually would build that bridge. And that's for me a symbol. Also, what's, as you mentioned, housing, for right? People can no longer afford rent and these kind of things. Yeah, because it has become almost impossible to build housing in many places. Like, we have cities, Vienna not so much, but London is a good example. But I think partially Amsterdam is a similar example, right? That need a complete overhaul and modernization of their infrastructure. But you can't build anything anymore because, you know, there might be, I don't know, a small rat population somewhere where you want to build tracks, and then you cannot build the tracks because you have to migrate that rat population somewhere. Or I think in the United States, they couldn't build a pipeline because of mosquitoes. All these, and this goes back to the culture question. At the end of the day, this is why you're right, where objectivity and opinion comes in, which is that objectively these problems are there, these matters are there. But then you have to pick, you have to pick a side. I mean, that, okay, either you say that every vermin that happens to live somewhere has to be given priority over infrastructure, but that means that we can't have the infrastructure. But then make that point. What bothers me in our contemporary debate is that very often politics tells you that you can have it both ways, right? That you can have, if we stick to this example, that you can have all the comforts of modern technology, of energy, of modern agriculture, without the downsides of modern agriculture, of energy, of everything that's needed. Like the Netherlands are a great example for this. You cannot have cheap, affordable, abundant food if at the same time you constantly try to make life harder for the farmers. And this is again what bothers me. Then be honest about it. And this goes back to the journalism question. Be honest about it. Then say, we want to make life hard for the farmers because we want you, the rubes, the average person, to eat less meat, to drink less milk. That's actually what we want. But don't tell them that, no, it's all going to be fine. It's all going to stay the same. Because it won't. And I think this is the problem we have. But the same with energy. We have been told now for decades that wind and solar, it will make electricity super cheap. The renewables will make electricity super cheap. In every single country, the growth of renewables was accompanied, except of course hydro and nuclear, but if it's wind and solar, was accompanied by higher electricity prices. And this goes back to what you said before, right? There is an objective reality. But in many of the issues of our everyday life, in energy, in economics, in gender relations, we are actually being told, to stick to your example, that 3 times 3 is 10. That closing down nuclear power plants will bring down electricity prices. Banning farmers from working their land and using fertilizer will bring down food prices. That banning developers from building houses will bring down rent, will bring down housing prices. Open up the borders for unskilled labor will be a boon to the economy. That there are not 2 genders, that there are 70 genders. That explaining to 7-year-olds how fantastic anal sex is will not leave them traumatized. Like we can go through this entire list. In fact, to go back to what you said, we are being told on a day-to-day basis that 3 times 3 is actually 10. And this is, I think, what so many people headed with. Because they see what's crime rates. My other favorite example. No, Germany has now honestly admitted that their crime rates are going up. In the United States, they claimed now for 5 years that crime rates are going down. And now, just a couple of weeks ago, the FBI silently updated their statistics. And lo and behold, the violent crime rate did not decline by 1.2%. It actually increased by 4.5%. And of course, justifiably, people said yes, because this is what we experienced. At the same, right, do you have the same in Europe? But no, there is migrant crime doesn't exist. It's not happening. But of course, people experience it on a regular basis. Of course it is happening. And we are back to what you said before. 3 times 3 is 10. And if you doubt it, you're a fascist, a Nazi, a right-wing radical, and ideally you should be in prison.
Yes. I guess I agree with you, but that still leaves the question, what can ordinary people do against this? Because it's kind of demoralizing to see. You see that 3 times 3 is 9. You see that your housing prices are going up, that food supply is becoming more insecure. You see inflation going up. You see all these things happening. What can you do about it if you're an ordinary person just going about their lives?
It's a great question. The answer that I have is that, contrary to what many would like you to believe, democracy is still working. Democracy is not dead. The only problem is people have to vote for those parties who they think are representing precisely what you just described, reality. And at the moment, for better or worse, those parties are the parties on the right. I mean, again, they are not flawless. I don't think they know Herbert Kickl in Austria, Donald Trump in the US, Geert Wilders in the Netherlands. These are not flawless, perfect people. But I think they are the best possible alternative. Giorgia Meloni in Italy. Viktor Orban in Hungary, right? These people, of course, this is the thing. So, oh my God, if I don't have the perfect candidate with whom I agree on 100% of the issues, I can't vote for them. No, you have to pick the candidate with whom you agree on the highest number of issues. And sometimes I feel, we see it again in Germany, we see it in Austria. It's a little bit odd that so often people complain about the state of affairs, but very often, it seems to me, a significant number is still voting for the very parties and politicians that are responsible for the current state of affairs. So I think this kind of cognitive dissonance needs to be overcome at some point. I mean, again, Germany is the best example. Right? lots of the problems that happened in Germany started under Angela Merkel, under the CDU-CSU government. And as it currently seems, the CDU-CSU will come in, the Christian Democrats will, and the next election will come in as the strongest party. And people are now expecting, well, if Friedrich Merz, if the conservatives take over, and you kind of say, no, because those guys were in charge just 5 years ago. They like all the idiotic decisions from open borders to shutting down nuclear power plants were made under a conservative government. Look at the United Kingdom. The government of Rishi Sunak was conservative in name only. Like that was not a conservative government. So people are now very upset with Keir Starmer and Labour, because Labour, honestly, and Keir Starmer have gone entirely insane. But even if now they would return to the Tories are just slightly further to the right of left of center, but they're not an actual conservative party band. And most people, I believe, want conservative government addressing the things that we just discussed, reality as it is, because one of the great qualities, I would argue, of true conservatism, for all its flaws, was always a respect for lack of a better term, respect for reality as it is. Right? The great thing about conservatism was always that they took human nature with all its flaws and all its greatness, but they never tended towards flights of fancy like the Marxists or the fascists or, the Bolsheviks, or you name it, or this idea that you can create the perfect society. Conservatism never believed in a perfect society because it would go against human nature, because we as beings are not perfect. But they were always realists. And I think that's at least my reason why I think that at the moment we have shifted too much in most of the West towards the left, and a rebalancing with reality. And I think that can only come from the right. I mean, there's one topic, just really quick, we haven't even touched upon, which is, the idea, again, all over the West, that you can simply spend your way out of a crisis. I mean, we live in incredibly indebted societies, and all of this is going to come crash down sooner or later. The Netherlands do it a little bit better than the Austrians, and the Swedes do it a little bit better than everybody else, but on the long run, none of it is truly sustainable. And if all of Europe goes under, the Swedes alone will not shoulder it. So there are all these things that I would hope that truly conservative or right-wing governments at some point would address. They probably won't do it either. So as I said before, there is no perfect solution, but at least we have to shift the trend into the right direction. It's like an ocean liner, right? You have an ocean liner, and our ocean liner is cruising towards an iceberg. And my impression is that the left says full speed ahead into the iceberg, and the right says, well, maybe we should at least try to shift a little bit and get away from the iceberg, or just slightly touch the iceberg, but not crash fully frontally into it.
I think that's a perfect end for our conversation. I think it's a very good point. I do believe that we have a choice indeed to not fully crash into the iceberg. I hope together in Europe we can do this. I really want to thank you. I think you had a lot of interesting points in these conversations. So thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, Daniel. It was a great pleasure.
Thank you. Our listeners, also thank you for listening. If you want to know more about New Rechts/New Right, you can find it on our website or on our social media. And let's say that Rolf, that people want to follow you. Where will we be able to follow you?
The best thing you can do is, I know this sounds a little bit weird, but just Google my name. It usually takes you right to either my X account or to my Substack or my columns in Unheard or Brussels Signal. So I think that's the best way to move forward, just to give it a quick Google search. Luckily, I'm in the lucky position that there are not that many Ralf Schöllhammers out there. It's not easy to confuse me with somebody else.
Thank you so much, and see you the next time.
Thank you so much, Peter.